Most people think disappearing is dramatic. But what if the real drama is staying visible to people who slowly drain the life out of you? There's a strange moment that happens to certain people after years of constant interaction. One day, they stop feeling understood by the people around them. The conversations start sounding repetitive. The laughter feels forced. Even the notifications begin to feel invasive. And without fully realizing why, they start craving distance. Not attention, distance. Carl Jung believed the human mind cannot hear itself clearly when surrounded by endless noise. Eventually, the personality people built for survival becomes so loud that the real self disappears underneath it. So people keep performing, replying instantly, explaining themselves constantly, maintaining friendships that already died emotionally years ago. Not because they want to, because they're afraid of what happens when they finally go silent, because silence exposes things. It exposes which relationships depended entirely on your availability. It exposes how many people only feel connected to you when they have uninterrupted access to your attention. And worst of all, it exposes the version of yourself you became just to remain accepted. Most people never notice how much of their personality is built around keeping others comfortable, until they disappear for a while. Then something unsettling begins happening. The people who claim to care about you start reacting differently to your absence. Some become irritated, some become strangely cold, some suddenly become overly interested in you again. Not because they miss you, because your silence interrupted their psychological control over your predictability. Predictable people make others feel safe. That's why society rewards over-explaining, emotional availability, and constant accessibility. Because a person who is always reachable is easier to emotionally manage, but the moment you disappear, even briefly, people are forced to confront something they hate. They no longer know where they stand with you, and uncertainty makes people uncomfortable, especially those who benefited from your constant presence. Carl Jung understood that isolation is not always loneliness. Sometimes it's psychological recovery. A withdrawal from unconscious performance, a temporary death of the false self. Because when you constantly surround yourself with people, you slowly lose the ability to distinguish who you truly are from who you became to survive socially. And the terrifying part is, most people never realize this is happening to them. They spend years maintaining an identity that was unconsciously shaped by fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of becoming invisible. But invisibility changes people. The moment nobody can constantly access you anymore, masks begin slipping, yours included. And what you discover during that silence may permanently change the way you see human nature. At first, disappearing feels wrong, almost guilty. Your fingers instinctively reach for the phone. You wonder if people think you're rude. You feel the urge to explain yourself before anyone even asks. That reaction alone reveals how deeply social conditioning has entered the mind. Because somewhere along the way, many people were taught that constant availability equals goodness. That replying quickly means you care. That always being present makes you valuable. That disappearing makes you selfish. But Jung believed something darker hides beneath this behavior. Most people are not afraid of losing others. They are afraid of being forgotten. So they remain emotionally accessible long after it begins destroying their inner world. They continue conversations they no longer enjoy, maintain friendships that feel emotionally hollow, laugh around people who secretly exhaust them. And slowly, they become strangers to themselves. The frightening thing about prolonged social exposure is that human beings unconsciously adapt their personality to survive their environment. Around one group, you become softer. Around another, more entertaining. Around others, quieter. After enough time, you stop knowing which version is actually you. You only know which version keeps people comfortable. That's why isolation becomes psychologically terrifying for some people. Because when the noise disappears, there's no audience left to perform for. And without an audience, the false self begins starving. This is where most people run back to distraction, back to texting, back to meaningless interaction, back to constant stimulation. Because silence is not peaceful in the beginning. Silence is confrontation. You begin noticing things that were impossible to see before. How certain people only contacted you when they needed emotional reassurance. How some friendships were built entirely on mutual distraction from loneliness. How often you betrayed your own boundaries just to avoid disappointing others. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you, And the worst part is, many people don't even realize they're doing it. Human beings naturally move toward emotional convenience. If you always listen, they will always unload. If you always forgive, they will continue crossing lines. If you always stay, they will assume you never leave. Not because they are evil, because humans adapt quickly to access. That's why your disappearance unsettles people more than your anger ever could. Anger still gives them attention. Silence removes it, and silence forces people into uncertainty. Suddenly, they begin wondering, did something change? Are they upset? Are they pulling away? But what truly disturbs them is not your absence. It's the realization that your world may continue without them at the center of it. People often confuse emotional possession with connection. They think frequent access means intimacy, constant communication means loyalty, immediate replies mean love, but some of the deepest psychological bonds exist in silence. Without performance, without maintenance, without constant reassurance. And when you disappear for a while, you begin separating real connection from dependency. That distinction changes everything. Because once you recognize how many relationships survive purely through habit and accessibility, you can never fully unsee it again. The mind becomes quieter, but colder too. You start observing people differently. Not through their words, through their reactions to your boundaries. That's when the real shift begins. Not when you leave people, when you start seeing them clearly. Because distance does something terrifying to human perception. It removes emotional fog, the constant exposure disappears, the endless conversations stop, and suddenly, patterns become visible that were hiding in plain sight the entire time. You notice who only spoke to you out of boredom, who subtly competed with you, who enjoyed your insecurity because it made them feel superior. And most disturbingly, you notice how often people punished you emotionally the moment you stopped behaving the way they expected. Not openly. Psychologically. A colder tone, delayed responses, passive aggression disguised as jokes, sudden emotional withdrawal. The human mind is extremely sensitive to shifts in control. When someone becomes less accessible, less explainable, less emotionally predictable, people instinctively feel it. Especially those who unconsciously depended on your consistency for their own emotional stability. This is why disappearing often changes social dynamics faster than self-improvement ever could, because people can tolerate your growth. What they struggle to tolerate is losing psychological access to you. There's a reason mysterious people disturb others. The mind feels safer around individuals it can fully predict. Once predictability disappears, projection begins. People start inventing explanations for your silence. He changed. They think they're better now. They're acting different. Maybe. Or maybe you simply stopped feeding everyone unlimited access to your energy. Carl Jung believed that much of human interaction operates unconsciously. People rarely understand the real motives behind their emotions. They only feel the emotional reaction itself. That's why some individuals become strangely irritated when you start protecting your peace. Your boundaries force them to confront parts of themselves they were avoiding. The friend who only feels important when constantly needed. The person who relies on your attention to escape their own emptiness. The one who mistakes emotional dependency for closeness. Your silence exposes all of it, and silence has a cruel way of revealing truths words were hiding. Sometimes you realize the people around you never truly knew you. They knew the version of you that was endlessly available, the version that tolerated everything. The version that kept sacrificing internal peace to maintain external harmony. But once that version disappears, relationships start malfunctioning, because many social bonds are quietly built on roles, not authenticity. One person plays the therapist, one plays the entertainer, one plays the emotional caretaker, and the moment someone stops performing their assigned role, people become uncomfortable, almost angry, as if individuality itself feels like betrayal. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears, because awareness changes your tolerance. You stop romanticizing emotional imbalance, stop excusing manipulative behavior, stop chasing people who only value you when you're easy to access. And strangely, the more comfortable you become with solitude, the more clearly you begin understanding human nature. Not in a hateful way, in a detached way. You begin realizing that many people are not connected to others emotionally. They are connected through unconscious needs, validation, attention, security, distraction from themselves, And once you see that, ordinary conversations begin feeling different, almost surreal, because underneath casual interaction, you start sensing the hidden psychological negotiations happening constantly between people. Who seeks approval? Who seeks dominance? Who fears abandonment? Who hides resentment behind politeness? Most people never notice these things because they never stay silent long enough to observe them. The longer you remain distant, the stranger the world starts to feel. Not because people changed, because your perception did. You begin realizing how much modern life is designed to keep people psychologically occupied at all times. Constant messages, constant updates, constant interaction, an endless stream of noise preventing anyone from sitting alone long enough to confront themselves. And that confrontation is precisely what Jung believed most people spend their lives avoiding. Because beneath the social personality, beneath the carefully managed image, there is something far less comfortable waiting in silence. The shadow, not evil, just rejected. The parts of yourself you buried to remain accepted by others. Your anger, your ambition, your envy, your emotional exhaustion, your desire to disappear from everyone without explanation. Most people suppress these feelings immediately. They call them toxic, selfish, wrong. But suppression does not erase anything psychologically. It only drives it deeper into the unconscious, where it begins controlling behavior indirectly. That's why some people suddenly explode after years of being nice. Why certain individuals become emotionally numb without understanding why. Why people wake up one day and feel disconnected from their own life. The shadow was ignored too long. And silence forces you to meet it. This is the stage where disappearing becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because eventually, there's nobody left to blame. No distractions left. No constant conversations to drown out your thoughts. Only you and the parts of yourself you spent years avoiding. You begin noticing how often your kindness was motivated by fear. How many of your relationships were maintained out of guilt. How much of your personality was built around avoiding rejection. That realization alone can fracture someone psychologically. Because people want to believe their identity is authentic. But deep isolation often reveals something darker. Large parts of the personality are adaptations, social survival mechanisms repeated so many times they started feeling real. The agreeable version of you, the funny version, the emotionally available version. Masks, useful masks, but still masks. And once you become aware of them, social interaction changes forever. You start hearing manipulation hidden inside normal conversations, not always malicious manipulation. Unconscious manipulation. People subtly testing boundaries, seeking reassurance, fishing for validation, trying to maintain emotional control over how they are perceived. Human beings do this constantly. Most are simply unaware of it. The disturbing part is realizing you do it too. Jung warned that people who only see darkness in others remain unconscious of their own shadow. True awareness begins the moment you recognize the same psychological patterns inside yourself. The need for validation, the desire to be admired, the quiet resentment toward people who ignored you, the satisfaction of being missed after disappearing. None of it makes you evil. It makes you human. And this is where many people misunderstand isolation. Isolation is not about becoming superior to others. It's about seeing yourself without distortion for the first time. That process is painful.
Because the ego depends on illusion to survive comfortably, but the illusion begins collapsing in silence. You start understanding why certain people constantly surround themselves with noise, relationships, entertainment, substances, attention.
Because if they ever truly stopped, they might meet the person underneath the performance, and they are terrified that person may feel empty or angry or lost, so they keep running. Most people are not addicted to social media. They are addicted to escaping themselves. And once you realize that, the world becomes impossible to look at the same way again. After enough time alone, something cold begins happening to the mind. You stop craving explanations from people. The need to defend yourself fades. The urge to correct misunderstandings disappears. Even approval starts losing its emotional power. Not because you became emotionless, because you finally saw how fragile most human perception actually is. People rarely see you as you are. They see you through the lens of their own needs, insecurities, and unresolved wounds. To one person, your silence feels arrogant. To another, mysterious. To someone else, threatening. The same behavior, different projections. And once you understand this, you begin wasting less energy trying to control how others perceive you. Because perception was never fully in your control to begin with. Carl Jung believed that until people become conscious of their unconscious patterns, those patterns will control their life, and they will call it fate. That is exactly what happens in most relationships. People repeat emotional cycles without ever recognizing them. The one who constantly chases emotionally unavailable people. The one who confuses being needed with being loved. The one who keeps sacrificing themselves hoping loyalty will eventually be reciprocated. Patterns, not destiny. And isolation exposes patterns brutally, especially the ones involving attachment. Because when you disappear from everyone for a while, withdrawal begins. Not just for others, for you. You start reaching for your phone without reason, wondering who noticed your absence, imagining conversations that never happened. That's when you realize something unsettling. Constant communication was not always connection. Sometimes it was addiction, a loop of emotional stimulation keeping the mind occupied. Notifications become tiny psychological reassurances. Replies become proof of significance. Attention becomes emotional oxygen. Remove it suddenly and people panic internally, not because they lost connection, because they lost distraction. This is why solitude feels unbearable to many individuals. In silence, there are no interruptions protecting you from your own thoughts. No validation, no performance, no escape, only awareness. And awareness changes a person permanently. You begin seeing social interaction almost like theater, everyone managing impressions, hiding insecurities carefully behind personality, pretending certainty while privately battling confusion. Some hide emptiness through humor, some through intelligence, others through dominance, beauty, success, constant relationships. But nearly everyone is hiding something. That's the uncomfortable truth isolation reveals. Human beings are psychologically fragile creatures pretending to feel secure, and society quietly rewards the people most skilled at maintaining the performance. But every performance has a cost. Some lose authenticity. Some lose peace. Some lose themselves completely. The terrifying part is that many people never realize it happened. They become so adapted to external validation that being alone with themselves feels psychologically threatening. So they keep surrounding themselves with noise until life ends, never truly meeting themselves once. Jung understood that individuation, becoming your true self, requires separation from collective expectations, which means at some point you must disappoint people. You must become less available, less explainable, less eager to maintain every connection, and certain people will resent you for it, not because you harmed them. Because your transformation forces them to confront their own stagnation. People don't resent your boundaries, they resent the version of themselves your boundaries expose. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is quietly disappear long enough to hear your own mind again. Because if you never separate yourself from the noise, you may spend your entire life confusing who you are with who the world rewarded you for being. Eventually you return, not dramatically. Most people won't even notice the exact moment it happens, but you notice it because something inside you no longer moves the same way. The old hunger for constant connection weakens. You stop needing every message answered immediately. You stop feeling responsible for maintaining every relationship. And for the first time, you begin understanding the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the pain of being unseen. Solitude is the peace of seeing yourself clearly. Most people never reach that distinction. They spend their lives terrified of silence because silence removes witnesses from their identity. Without constant interaction, they no longer know who they are. That is why so many people panic when someone disappears, not because absence is cruel, because absence interrupts psychological dependency. When access disappears, reality surfaces. The friend who only called when they needed emotional support slowly vanishes. The people who claimed they cared suddenly stop reaching out. The ones who truly valued you remain quietly, without demanding constant proof of your availability. And that realization changes the structure of your relationships forever. You become more selective, not out of ego, out of awareness. Because once you see how many interactions are built on unconscious emotional transactions, you stop romanticizing human connections so blindly. You begin understanding that some people love attention more than intimacy. Some love control more than connection. Some only feel close to others when they are emotionally needed by them. And many people who say they miss you are really saying, I miss access to how you made me feel. There's a difference, a painful one, but an important one. Carl Jung believed the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. What most people ignore is how psychologically violent that process can become. Because becoming yourself often requires destroying versions of yourself that kept other people comfortable. The agreeable version, the endlessly available version, the version afraid to disappoint anyone. And not everyone will like what emerges afterward. Some people only love the parts of you they could influence. The moment they can no longer predict your reactions, your emotions, or your availability, tension appears, because control thrives on predictability. That's why silence unsettles manipulative people more than confrontation ever will. Confrontation still gives them engagement, still gives them emotional access. And humans struggle deeply with doors they cannot reopen, especially psychologically. After enough solitude, you start noticing another disturbing truth. Most people are far more influenced by collective behavior than they realize. Opinions, desires, life goals, even personality traits. Large portions of identity are unconsciously borrowed from the surrounding environment. That's why isolation changes perception so radically. Distance weakens social hypnosis. You begin asking questions most people avoid. Do I actually enjoy these relationships? Or have I simply maintained them for years? Do I truly believe these ideas? Or did I inherit them from the people around me? Am I living authentically? Or am I performing a socially acceptable character? These questions are dangerous because once they enter the mind sincerely, life cannot return to unconsciousness. That's the real reason disappearance changes people. Not because isolation magically transforms them, because silence reveals what constant noise was preventing them from seeing. And some truths permanently alter the way you experience human nature. Especially the realization that many people are not searching for truth, connection, or authenticity. They are searching for comfort, even if that comfort slowly destroys who they really are. Eventually, you return. Not dramatically. Most people won't even notice the exact moment it happens, but you notice it, because something inside you no longer moves the same way. The old hunger for constant connection weakens. You stop needing every message answered immediately. You stop feeling responsible for maintaining every relationship. And for the first time, you begin understanding the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the pain of being unseen. Solitude is the peace of seeing yourself clearly. Most people never reach that distinction. They spend their lives terrified of silence because silence removes witnesses from their identity. Without constant interaction, they no longer know who they are. That is why so many people panic when someone disappears, not because absence is cruel, because absence interrupts psychological dependency. When access disappears, reality surfaces. The friend who only called when they needed emotional support slowly vanishes. The people who claimed they cared suddenly stop reaching out. The ones who truly valued you remain quietly, without demanding constant proof of your availability. And that realization changes the structure of your relationships forever. You become more selective, not out of ego, out of awareness. Because once you see how many interactions are built on unconscious emotional transactions, you stop romanticizing human connection so blindly. You begin understanding that some people love attention more than intimacy, some love control more than connection, some only feel close to others when they are emotionally needed by them. And many people who say they miss you are really saying, I miss access to how you made me feel. There's a difference, a painful one, but an important one. Carl Jung believed the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. What most people ignore is how psychologically violent that process can become. Because becoming yourself often requires destroying versions of yourself that kept other people comfortable. The agreeable version, the endlessly available version, the version afraid to disappoint anyone. And not everyone will like what emerges afterward. Some people only love the parts of you they could influence. The moment they can no longer predict your reactions, your emotions, or your availability, tension appears, because control thrives on predictability. That's why silence unsettles manipulative people more than confrontation ever will. Confrontation still gives them engagement, still gives them emotional access, but silence closes the door without explaining why. And humans struggle deeply with doors they cannot reopen, especially psychologically. After enough solitude, you start noticing another disturbing truth. Most people are far more influenced by collective behavior than they realize. Opinions, desires, life goals, even personality traits. Large portions of identity are unconsciously borrowed from the surrounding environment. That's why isolation changes perception so radically. Distance weakens social hypnosis. You begin asking questions most people